Hey there, folks, and we are live. We are live on Facebook, and I must admit, folks, this is a little bit of an experiment. I just saw the news about Mark Zuckerberg announcing that Facebook is teaming up with the Atlantic Council. They're having an official partnership. Now, what is the Atlantic Council? Well, the Atlantic Council is a think tank closely tied in with NATO. It's funded by a lot of weapons manufacturing corporations, and it's also actually funded by a lot of Middle Eastern governments. The government of Qatar is involved. We've also got the Saudis are involved in it. All the NATO governments are involved in it. So Facebook is officially partnering with this Middle Eastern think tank. So when they basically announce that they're tied in with a think tank that is blatantly partisan, blatantly in favor of the Western European governments against Russia, against China, against Venezuela, against Iran, you have to wonder how much longer is it going to be before Facebook is just completely politically controlled. I mean, how much longer is Facebook going to allow good videos and good reporting to keep going? I don't know. However, you have to admit the Facebook folks are kind of walking a bit of a tightrope. Why? Well, because if they exercise their political control too much, and if they push the envelope too much and shut down and silence people they disagree with too much, pretty soon other social media outlets are going to prop up, and people that want to hear other views are just going to go elsewhere. So they're kind of walking a tightrope at this point. They're not exactly sure how much control they want to exercise. But when we see Facebook officially announcing that they have a relationship with the Atlantic Council, we know that they are taking a side. We know that they are politically aligned, that Mark Zuckerberg and the owners of Facebook are at this point being pretty blatant and in your face about the fact they take an anti-Russia position, they take an anti-Chinese position, that they support Western capitalism against those forces in the world struggling against it. They support Wall Street and the billionaire bankers that are trying to run the world. So let's be blatantly clear about that. But this is a bit of an experiment. I've done YouTube lives before. This is my first, full-length Facebook Live where I just sit here and talk to people. So if folks have any questions or anything they want me to discuss, just, put it in the messages. I'll see it. And let's have a chat. I'm already having fun. We just started here. It's about 3 minutes in. So I've got a number of things I wanted to talk to folks about. Now, forgive me if folks have already seen the video, but I just have to talk about this. Today's weekend review of the Wall Street Journal. Let me get it in the webcam here. So we've got the Wall Street Journal. They do the weekend review. In addition to the business section and the news section, they have the weekend review. And so this weekend, it's all about Venezuela, the tragedy of Venezuela, right? And it's a big, long anti-Venezuelan article, right? Blaming the Venezuelan government for all the problems. But interestingly, now I read, the Wall Street Journal like I faithfully do every weekend, and I noticed that the second paragraph of this anti-Venezuelan tirade has a pretty important point in it. This is the second paragraph. Quote, "When I arrived in Venezuela in 2013, this is the author of the article, the journalist who's writing this big, long piece against the Venezuelan government. He writes, when I arrived in Venezuela in 2013, the party was still on. Oil was fetching over $100 a barrel. And Mr. Maduro's populist government was showering petrodollars on everyone. The Caracas skyline was dotted with grandiose construction projects. Steakhouses were buying vintage scotch by the container load, and hotels had to be reserved weeks in advance." So this article, the author of this piece, is basically confirming what I've been telling people all along, that Venezuela's economic hardships started back in 2014 when the oil prices dropped. Venezuela's entire economy is centered around oil, has been. That was the way it was under the capitalism, the wild free market neoliberalism of the 1990s. That's how it is today. But now, since 1999 and since the Bolivarian Revolution, the economy of Venezuela has been centered around, the state control of oil. The oil isn't just in the hands of Western companies. It was nominally nationalized before, but basically prior to Chavez and the Bolivarians, they just kind of let American oil companies go in there and do whatever they want. But Chavez changed that. In 2003 specifically, he changed the laws so that the proceeds of Venezuela's oil money would go into the state budget, so that Venezuela would basically be using the oil profits to benefit their own economy. And when the oil prices were very, very high, especially during the Bush years, I mean, oil prices were through the roof, $100 a barrel, $110 a barrel. Venezuela's economy was doing very well. And they were using the oil profits to really raise a lot of people out of poverty. When I was in Venezuela, I walked through neighborhoods where all these houses, it was pointed out to me that all the houses in the neighborhood had been built with interest-free loans provided by the Venezuelan government. When I was in the neighborhood, I just saw so much that the Venezuelan government did. They had, I remember that they had these cable cars that would carry people up the mountains. They'd all been constructed by the Venezuelan government. I went into one neighborhood where they had this community theater. It was just a really nice theater. And this is where they did talent shows, where they had the graduations and weddings and all kinds of things in the neighborhood, totally available to people in the neighborhood, just a state-of-the-art theater. They had concerts there and whatnot. And it was just this beautiful theater. And prior to the Venezuelan process, the Bolivarian Revolution beginning, this had actually been the place that the local car thieves would come and break up their cars, and it was the heroin buying spot. And instead, the Venezuelans, with their state control of oil, had transformed it into this beautiful community center. They've set up a whole network of community-controlled radio stations, artist collectives, and they've done a whole lot to provide jobs. Illiteracy is a big problem they've had in Venezuela. A lot of the urban slums and a lot of the indigenous folks out in the countryside couldn't read or write. And what they did immediately is Venezuela started hiring Cuban teachers to come into Venezuela and start teaching the low-income folks who didn't have access to education how to read. And they eliminated illiteracy. They also set up these healthcare clinics where they brought in Cuban doctors, and they gave people healthcare in Venezuela for free. You could just walk in, and these low-income Venezuelans walked in. In Venezuela, they had a lot of people who were blind because they didn't have proper nutrition and they just needed some basic surgery, and they were giving people surgery, and so people were seeing. For the first time in their lives, they were seeing because of what Venezuela was doing. And so the state control of Venezuela's economy centered around this state-run oil company had a lot of really good results. And the problems, as the Wall Street Journal admits, they began in 2014. They began when the oil prices dropped. They began after Chavez died and there were political divisions in the country. That's when all these things began. And so this idea that socialism is what's causing all of Venezuela's problems, that's just absurd. In Venezuela during the 1990s, the country was in a complete wreck. The garbage wasn't being picked up. Electricity would go off once or twice a week, people would tell me. It was just a disaster when the IMF and the World Bank was in Venezuela just wrecking the place. The reason that Chavez came to power was because public transportation in Caracas got so bad there was an uprising. They called it the Caracazo, and it just rocked Venezuela in the early 90s, and then there was a feeling they needed a revolution. So Chavez picked up the gun and he tried to take power in kind of a military coup like Fidel Castro did. He failed. He went to prison, but he was released from prison, and eventually he got elected. But let's see what else is going on here. What are people saying? People are thanking me for what I do. I appreciate that. Oil prices are sensitive due to financial speculation. Thank you, Robert Bull. And that's a good point. However, I want to point out that it's not just that. When the oil prices dramatically decreased back in 2014, Michael Reagan, the son of Ronald Reagan, actually wrote an article where he admitted that his father, Ronald Reagan, had intentionally manipulated the oil markets in order to hurt the Soviet Union. That back in the 1980s, Michael Reagan says that what his father did is he went to the Saudis and had them start churning cheap oil into the market, so that as the Soviet Union was selling oil to West Germany and had built this huge pipeline to sell oil into Europe, that they would lose money. And it was intentional. And that's what they did in 2014. Obama, it was kind of a soft power strategy to put the squeeze on Russia, put the squeeze on Venezuela, put the squeeze on Iran, put the squeeze on all the countries, the independent developing countries that are in the oil business, Ecuador, others. It was an intentional strategy. Michael Reagan admits that his father did it, and he called on Obama to do it, to do what his father Ronald Reagan had done. So this was intentional, and the Saudis were losing money. And still the Saudis are just in a wreck. They've wrecked their own economy. Now the oil prices are going back up. We're approaching $80 a barrel. People are saying that gas prices are going to be high by the end of the summer. People are approaching $80 a barrel, but still the Saudis, the Saudis have really royally messed up their own economy by going along with Obama's strategy to wreck the economies of anti-imperialist countries. But basically, I want to get to the point here, which is that basically, Wall Street and London, don't leave out London, talk about Wall Street and London. They have the world trapped in a prison called oil dependency, or the oil-based economy. It's not just a prison, it's a death trap. I mean, the way we have the oil and the world economy centered around oil production, it's basically a death trap because they control the oil markets. We got the super major oil companies, Exxon Mobil, Royal Dutch Shell. We've got BP, British Petroleum. You go down the line, these super major oil companies have basically got the world trapped because the oil markets are basically cornered by, these giant Wall Street conglomerates. And, Chase Bank is closely tied in with ExxonMobil. That's the Rockefeller family, one of the most powerful families in American politics. It's the heirs of Standard Oil. The Rockefellers, right? The people who have, just polluted art in the United States and funded, the work of Jackson Pollock and really done everything they can to kind of destroy art that has any socially conscious message. The Rockefeller families that work with the Council on Foreign Relations, one of the main funders of the Council on Foreign Relations. The Rockefellers that really brought us Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand and neoliberalism. The folks that are, really sinister elements that have moved back and forth between the Democratic and Republican parties. And at this point, they're pretty close to the Democratic Party for strategic reasons. That element, the big oil conglomerates, the oil bankers, the richest people in the world, that they basically have the world economy rigged because they dominate the world oil markets. And because of that, they can control the world economy. And that's why they're very, very terrified of what China is doing right now, because China is not an oil importing or an oil exporting country. They're not like Russia, Venezuela, Iran. They are an oil importing country. That's why they want to protect the South China Sea, because China brings in a lot of their overseas oil via oil tankers in the South China Sea. So they're setting up their military there to make sure that no one messes with them in the South China Sea. But regardless, China they know that their huge industrial economy, they're making half the steel in the world, the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world, well over half the copper in the world. China is a huge center of manufacturing. But if the oil supply is cut off, if there's a blockade in the South China Sea, the lights go out. I mean, China is dependent in that way. So China is pouring huge amounts of investment and research into alternative energy, fusion energy, nuclear power, trying to do everything they can to get us out of this oil trap. Capitalism has the world trapped in an oil-based economy, and it's a trap, and it's a way to keep, the Morgans and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the DuPonts and the Rothschilds in control of the world economy. And by the way, people, folks want to blame Venezuela and blame socialism for the problems in the world economy. What's the top oil exporting country in Africa right now? It's Nigeria. And in Nigeria, Royal Dutch Shell, that super major Wall Street oil company, it's not owned by the Dutch anymore. Now it's Wall Street controlled. And they have just devastated the conditions. Most of the oil in Nigeria comes out of the Niger Delta region. And if you want to see how great capitalism is, if you want to see what capitalism does for people around the world, Google the Niger Delta region and see what those oil companies are doing there. Nigeria is the wealthiest part of Africa at this point in terms of oil. And the people there live in extreme poverty. Royal Dutch Shell has been not only just, the people there are just getting ripped off. The oil beneath their feet is making huge amounts of profit for Wall Street and London bankers, but they're living in poverty. But on top of that, there have been these catastrophic oil spills where there's just been oil spilling out into the ocean, but also into the places where people live. And they aren't even bothering to clean these things up. I mean, Royal Dutch Shell, there have been these huge oil spills, and they haven't even bothered to take care of it. They haven't even bothered to clean it up, and people are still suffering years after this oil spills. They don't even care. So if you think that, if you think Venezuela's problems are all because of socialism and capitalism is the cause, is just great, look at Nigeria. I mean, and, Nigeria is now the largest oil exporting country in Africa. But before 2011, the largest oil exporter in Africa was Libya. And Libya, according to the CIA World Factbook and according to the United Nations statistics, they had the highest life expectancy. They had the highest rates the lowest rates of infant mortality, highest rates of literacy. They had achieved huge amounts. And Libya, that was, Gaddafi, it was an Islamic socialist government. They had nationalized their oil. And as a result, Libyans were living very well. Now, what has happened? Now Libya, the independent government, the socialist government of Gaddafi has been overthrown. And now Libya is so bad, people are piling onto rafts trying to get out of there. The country's divided. They've got two different governments. They're killing each other. It's a complete and utter mess. So Libya has been wrecked. Libya has joined the capitalist global economy. They've joined the free market. They've gotten rid of Gaddafi, the socialist leader, and now it's a mess of terrorism. Now it's poverty. Now things are so bad, people are trying to get out of there. You know, whenever people start telling you stories about people on rafts coming out of Cuba, think about the people that are piling onto rafts every day. Every day people are piling onto rafts, getting in the Mediterranean Ocean, trying to get to Europe to get out of what capitalism has done to Libya. What the free market has brought to Libya, right? The free market capitalist system, the Islamic socialist government of Gaddafi, the government that supported the IRA, the government that supported the people of South Africa in fighting for their liberation. The Libyan government was toppled. The socialist government that provided healthcare and education to the population, that government has been overthrown. The government that eradicated illiteracy and hunger in Libya, that's been toppled. Libya has joined the Western capitalist system. And look at what Libya is like today. Look at Libya. That is a showcase for what the free market and what regime change can bring to the world. You know, whenever they're trying to topple a government, they say it's for humanitarian reasons, right? They care so much about those poor Syrians. They care so much about those poor Iraqis. They care about those Afghans and those Venezuelans. Oh, they're suffering. And the USA, we got to go in and save the day. Look at Libya right now. Look at the conditions there. People piling onto rafts, ISIS killing people, terrorist groups, slavery on the African continent. Look at Iraq. Look at Iraq, you know, Iraq was once a very stable country, Ba'ath Arab socialist government. You know, you can criticize it all you want. You know, Saddam Hussein did a lot of bad things, but regardless, look at Iraq today. Is it any better off? Look at Afghanistan. The USA has been in Afghanistan since 2002, actually 2001. I believe it was November of 2001. It's been chaos, 16 years of chaos in Afghanistan. You know, the only people in Afghanistan that have been liberated by this war are the drug dealers, right? The heroin cartels of Afghanistan have been liberated by the liberation and by the NATO occupation. 16 years of utter chaos. Show me a single place that capitalism and the USA has gone in and ever made it better. When do these humanitarian interventions ever make life better for the people? I'm sorry, I'm getting fired up here, but it just bothers me to see people fall for this over and over and over again. You know, it's like, you know, you can fool somebody once, but how many times are we going to fall for this? You know, the president, he's Bush or a Democrat or a Republican or whoever, and he's on TV and he's like, oh, you know, we have to rescue these poor people. They're gonna die, and you know, we don't want a war. We don't believe in war, but how can we let these poor innocent people die? It's propaganda, folks. It's a lie, and they've played it on us so many times in NATO. You know, the intervention in Serbia, the destruction of Yugoslavia. You know, how many times are we going to fall for this, folks? If you look at all these situations, no matter what you think of the leader who was there before, no matter what you think of the government that was there before, the result is making things worse. Look at Eastern Europe, for example, right? Eastern Europe, we were always hearing about how oppressive the government of Romania was, the government of Czechoslovakia was, the government of Hungary was. These were evil communist regimes. Well, look what happened in the 1990s to all of those countries. What was the result of the free market coming into Eastern Europe? Did life get better for these people? Did their lives get better? Not at all. Polls show in every single one of those countries, polls come out and people say that life was better when they had socialist governments. The free market has created mass unemployment. People fled. They couldn't live in those countries any longer. One thing that the free market brought to Eastern Europe during the 1990s and is still all over Eastern Europe is sex trafficking. Right? Sex trafficking. They did not have, people were not being rounded up and sold as sex slaves around the world. Women in Eastern Europe, that was not happening under the Marxist-Leninist governments of the Eastern Bloc. That is what the free market brought to Eastern Europe. I mean, it is really horrendous. So, you know, this idea that Western capitalism goes around freeing people and liberating them, that's a bunch of nonsense. It's just a bunch of complete and utter nonsense. And right now, you want to talk about economics. Right now, the world is stuck in a trap of what you might call monopolistic stagnation. Because the oil bankers are desperate to keep the world stuck in their oil-based economy, hold back progress, hold back development, and keep the world in a trap. And that's why all these countries they attack, all the governments that they tend to attack for the most part, they tend to be governments that are modernizing and industrializing the country. You know, Iraq, that was Saddam Hussein, a Ba'ath socialist. He was into construction, building things up. Libya, They're against the government of Iran. I've been to Iran about 4 times. I've seen, the huge efforts toward modernization the government has done there, the funding of scientific research, the efforts the government of Iran has done to, the huge highways they built, the huge power plants. They brought running water and electricity and telephones to all the people in the rural areas. That's what they're trying to crush. They want to crush development, because if the world stays deeply poor and underdeveloped, if the world stays deeply poor and underdeveloped, then they have to buy everything from Wall Street. And they have a monopoly. And that's what this is about. It's about maintaining a monopoly. And it's not only that they want to keep countries from developing, they want to stop scientific progress. Because if we get out of the oil-based economy, if China is successful in what they're doing with fusion energy right now, what they're doing with artificial intelligence right now, if China is successful, then people aren't going to need to keep, being good customers, being good, loyal customers to Mr. Rockefeller and Mr. Carnegie and Mr. DuPont. It's about maintaining a monopoly for the Wall Street oil bankers. And that's what's going on in the world today. And it's not good for anybody. And Russia and China, people call them the Eurasian superpowers, the Eurasian alliance. They present an alternative to this global setup. They present a situation where we can have an economy that is state-controlled, centered around state control and planning, not profits, and countries can be able to develop independently and economically, raise themselves up, fund scientific research, fund alternative energy, fund computer programming, and we could really just raise people up. But you can't do that if you have an economy based on profits. The irrationality of the markets is blocking human development and human progress. In order to keep the world in a situation where these small cliques of oil bankers, where they stay in the center, Wall Street and London, they want to keep the world poor and hold back scientific progress. And that's the situation that we're in. And that is why there's an all-out war against Russia and China. And they are at the center of a block of countries that are rejecting the monopolism of Wall Street and the billionaire elites. But I've got a lot of comments here to look at. Would like to hear you speak about the potential for socialist revolution. Interesting. That's why NATO always bombs the infrastructure. And that is a very good point, Simon. That why is it NATO always bombs the infrastructure? That's because that's what they're targeting. The regimes that are targeted, or the governments that are targeted because they are building up infrastructure. That's what they're doing. But listen, I've been pretty fired up here. I'm going to calm down just a little bit, take a glass of water, drink of water here from my lovely metal water. Keep asking me questions, folks. I got plenty more to talk about. I'm sorry I was so fired up there. I hate to see people fall for this, and it's frustrating to see that basically Facebook admitting that they're working with the Atlantic Council. I mean, that is just completely and utterly ridiculous. I don't know what to make of that. But anyway, a lot of things are going on in the world today. I did want to mention this. I wrote this book, Getting Rich Without Capitalism. This is the book I wrote. And it's interesting because, I've published little books in my articles before, but this one in particular seems to have struck a chord. I continue to sell copies of it, and it's interesting. I continue to sell it, and I continue to get emails about it. People are struck by the title. And the reason I called it Getting Rich Without Capitalism is because there's this misconception, and I hear it all the time, that socialists want people to be poor. Have you ever heard this before? A lot of people believe that. I've had, people say to me, I used to go out on the street and people would say, oh, how can you wear those nice shoes if you're a socialist, right? But this is stuff even infects the left. People are like, well, I don't want to be capitalistic. I'm gonna try to not make too much money. I don't want to be capitalistic. No. Socialism, the way Karl Marx understood it, the way socialists have always understood it, really until the 1950s, was the idea that everybody should be able to live a decent life. Huey Long, who was a kind of a left-wing populist in U.S. history, he said, every man a king, but none shall wear a crown. Before that, you had William Jennings Bryan who said that. And socialists, they always had the understanding that they wanted people to increase their standard of living. They wanted people to get better and to have a better life. The idea, though, was that there's a group of people who get rich by keeping everybody else poor and making everybody else poor. And that socialism would get rid of that. And it would get rid of a situation where people become wealthy at the expense of other people, and would create a situation where people became wealthy in the process of society getting wealthy in the process, right? Like a tide raises all boats, as they say. That's a rising tide raises all boats. That was the idea, is that society could be advancing together. But that under capitalism, you have a situation where a small group of people own the major banks, major factories, major centers of economic power, the oil wells, the big box stores. And because of that, they create a situation where they continue to enrich themselves by keeping the rest of the world poor and making other people poor. So that's the issue. The issue is not, socialists do not worship poverty. Socialists do not want people to be poor. Caleb, why is the USA the richest country and owns the biggest debt? That's from Roberto Guerrero. Well, that's a very good question, Roberto. And the reason for that is that basically our government has been rigged. Our government has been rigged. The Federal Reserve System has been set up. So for every dollar that we print in the United States, we have the Federal Reserve bankers getting us deeper into debt. Our government has basically been turned into a money-making machine for bankers. So a lot of people, they think that, they pay their taxes, and out of that tax money, the government spends money on wars and drones and tanks and also social welfare programs and prisons and all kinds of things. That's not the case. The money that you pay goes to pay off debt to bankers. It's a rigged game that they've set up. So basically, the bankers have turned our government into a way to make money. And it is the biggest ripoff that you've ever seen. I don't know if folks remember, back in 2011, just before the Occupy Wall Street protests began, the credit rating of the United States actually, it went down, or it went up. Because of the debt ceiling crisis that took place. The Republicans wouldn't pass a new budget for Obama. There was one of these debt ceilings and all of that. And because of that, the USA's credit rating went down. Here's something that anyone should have been asking themselves. This is the US government. They have the right to tell banks how much and at what amount they can lend them money at interest. Why do private banks get to set the credit rating of the United States and to set the amount? I mean, this is ridiculous. Basically, there was always an understanding. If you go back throughout world history, right? I mean, you can read the Bible, you can read the Quran, you can read the Torah, that lending money at interest is not moral, right? That one should earn money by working. If you go out and you work hard to do something and you get paid for it, that's good. If you go out and you invent something and you start a business, that's good. But when you make money by having money, when you give somebody money and they give it back to you, or there's a Woody Guthrie song where he says, "Give me back 2 for the one I lend you," right? That's not moral. That there's something inherently wrong with making money by having money. And whenever you have a situation where people are making money by having money, the result is that pretty soon those people that are making money by having money become at the center of the world economy. And they start being richer and richer than everybody else. That's something that was always understood to be a problem. They talk about usury, ribald. You can go down throughout history. Every civilization, every major religion has warned against that activity. And really, with the dawn of capitalism, you saw the rise of these huge banking institutions that just came to dominate over society and to control governments. And industrial capitalism began. You had your titans of industry, those ruthless guys, John D. Rockefeller and the Carnegies, and the railroad, what they called the robber barons, the railroads. And these guys were ruthless. They murdered strikers, and they were rotten and ruthless. But by about 1900, they had all gotten into the banking sphere. It was the banking that dominated. Industrial capital was just subordinated to financial capital. And that was the rise of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism that Lenin wrote about. When we got the banking institutions based in the United States, based in Western Europe, Britain, France, Germany, dominating the entire world, the rise of the financial imperialist capitalism that came to mark the 20th century. So it's fascinating stuff here. And any word on NATO bombing the man-made river canal of Libya? NATO has bombed all kinds of things. In Libya, I think what you're referring to is the fact that prior to 2011, Libya, it's a very dry country. And that the Gaddafi government had constructed these vast, what you might call these vast systems of bringing water across the country. irrigation systems that they had constructed. It was very, very efficient, and it was, they were greening the desert essentially and making it possible to grow food, and that there was this huge effort to build these kind of pipelines to pump water throughout this desertous country. And it was bombed and destroyed during the NATO war. And that's part of the reason people are fleeing Libya en masse, is that it's much harder to live there now that their infrastructure has been destroyed. But I want to talk about some other things here. There's a lot to talk about. One thing I want to talk about is just, I want to step back from all this world politics that I'm talking about. What we're doing here on this page and on my YouTube channel and here on this page is really, really special. This is really, really something special that we're doing here. No one's doing exactly what we do. There are some folks that are out there, talking about conspiracy theories. There are some folks that are out there, giving kind of, leftist politics and leftist analysis. But what we do here, this is really unique. We talk about world events. We talk about economics. We talk about human progress and scientific development. And this is a really, really unique page. And this is a really, really unique community. People think I don't read the comments. People always assume that, if they talk to me, the comment just goes out into outer space. I read everything on this page. And it can be difficult sometimes, especially when I'm getting flamed by, right-wing Venezuelans who have no idea what they're talking about. I read every comment. If you leave a comment on this page, I can guarantee you that I'm reading it. I'm coming across it. And we are a special community. You and me, wherever you are watching this, you and me, we're part of a special community because we get it. What I just said about Libya and how the U.S. intervention in Libya, the NATO intervention made life worse, that should be common sense, right? I know that. You know that. That should be common sense. And to you and me, it's just kind of, did life get better in Libya when the NATO went in and toppled Gaddafi? Did that make life any better? No. That's common sense to you and I. But beyond our page, out in the real world, people don't know that. So you and I, we're doing something very, very special here. We are the ones who are saying here on this page that the emperor has no clothes, that what you think is true is not true, that what you are told to say is not the case. I always make the analogy, remember Bill Cosby? Do folks remember that? Right? When I was growing up, it was the Huxtables, the Bill Cosby show. Everyone thought Bill Cosby was just a nice guy, right? He was funny, he was wholesome, he didn't swear, and he wasn't sexually explicit, and he was this wholesome guy, and he had this show, and he was just such a nice fellow. And if you had said to somebody, if you'd said to me, if you'd said to somebody else, well, Bill Cosby, he drugs women, he gives them drugs, and then rapes them after they've passed out. If you had said that to me, I wouldn't have believed you. I'd have been like, oh, come on. I wouldn't have believed you. And I wouldn't have been the only one. All kinds of people would not have believed that. He just seemed like such a great guy, wholesome and friendly. Well, now we know Bill Cosby is a monster, right? What he was doing for years behind the scenes in Hollywood to women, to scores of women, was absolutely abominable and disgusting. And what people should learn from that is that what seems like it's true is not always true. Just because you think something is true, just because everyone knows something, right, doesn't mean it's true. Everyone knew that Bill Cosby was a good guy. Bill Cosby was a monster. He was a rapist. He was doing horrendous things to women all the time and getting away with it. And if you just appealed to common sense, you would have thought Bill Cosby was a swell, good old fellow, wholesome, nice, all-American entertainment. And you would have been wrong. And let's go back even further. There was a time where it was common sense to believe that the earth was flat, right? People believed that the earth was flat. And if you looked outside, the earth didn't look round, right? You could roll coins across the floor. It didn't look round. And people it was common sense. Everyone knew that the earth was flat. Everybody knew it. If you said, I think the earth is round, they'd go, oh, get out of here, you weirdo. Look out there. It's clearly the earth is flat. The earth isn't flat. The earth is round. We now know that. And we know that because of scientific breakthroughs that people did and the use of mathematics and astronomy. And it was some courageous individuals who came forward and said, the earth is round. And then we know about later with Kepler and Copernicus saying that the universe doesn't revolve around the earth. In fact, the earth revolves around the sun. And that's where the word revolution comes from. People think revolution is about bloodshed and violence and killing. No, the word revolution goes back to the time where the Roman Catholic Church was telling people that the universe was at the center of the world. And the revolutionaries were those who said that the earth revolved around the sun. And that's what made them revolutionaries. That the word revolution comes out of the struggle for science and for scientific progress. That's the origin of the word Revolution. And interestingly, the word left and right comes from that period as well. Right after the French Revolution, when you had the toppling of the king, they formed the National Assembly in France. And those that were more supportive of feudalism and the old monarchy, they sat on the right. And those who sat on the left, according to what was written, there's a letter written there, they said it was the innovators who sat on the left. The innovators sat on the left. That's what it means to be a leftist. A leftist is an innovator. It's a creative person. It's someone who wants to drive history forward. They want things to get better for humanity. They want science. They want historical progress. That's what left is about. The right are those who want to conserve the existing institutions, conserve authority, conserve what exists before. And the left are those who want to go forward, right? That's the difference between left and right. That's how the terms originated. But a lot of people look at that and they say, well, I don't see that, Caleb. When I see the left, I see a lot of people, beating drums and, wanting to go back to nature, man, and smoking marijuana and acting all crazy. Yes, but that's not the real left. That's a synthetic creation, right? And this is where people are going to say, oh my gosh, Caleb, you sound crazy. No, I want you to, if you don't believe me, don't take my word for it. Type into Google. Go to Google right now. I dare you to go into Google right now and type in the phrase Congress for Cultural Freedom. Type it in. Just do it right now. I dare you. Congress for Cultural Freedom. And what will come up, probably one of the first things, if not the first thing that comes up, will be from a website called CIA.gov. That's the actual website of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. And you'll read them brag about a program that they launched in the 1950s for the purpose of distorting left-wing politics, in order to distort left-wing politics and pull Western intellectuals away from actual Marxism and toward a cultural formation. You read this article, the CIA brags about how they funded the Partisan Review, which was a Trotskyite magazine that printed the writings of George Orwell and Noam Chomsky and Susan Sontag. You'll see them talking about Sidney Hook, and how they basically funded leftism in the hopes of, quote, beating the Soviets at their own game. The left that we know, the people that are going around and beating on drums and using lots of drugs and think that we just need to go back to nature and that science is uptight and square, man, and that we should all just, go out and protest when Rachel Maddow tells us to, and that the working people, average working class folks, are stupid and square and they need to go to Harvard and take a course on gender studies. That element is not the real left. That element is something that was synthetically created for the purpose of preventing people from actually challenging capitalist power. That's the reality. The 1960s left, and these elements took off. I mean, there's material reasons for this too, because, starting in the 1950s up until about the 70s and 80s, the USA did have a booming economy. So a lot of working class folks weren't really interested in socialist politics. So in the context of a booming economy, you had Richard Nixon and his silent majority. You had the hard hats who used to go beat up hippies and protesters. In that context, leftism was only popular among this intellectual milieu. You had CIA money going in there and distorting there. And now we have this element out there, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefellers, George Soros. Yes, I said George Soros. He's a real person. What Glenn Beck and all of them say about him is not accurate, but there is a real person called George Soros, a billionaire from Hungary who does fund left-wing activism. I'm sorry that that's not appropriate to say in democratic circles, but that's the truth. There is George Soros, a guy who worked to topple socialist governments in Eastern Europe, a raving anti-communist liberal billionaire. That there was this element, the highest levels, the most rich and powerful, ExxonMobil, the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller think tanks, Congress for Cultural Freedom. These elements have created a synthetic creation that calls itself left. And this synthetic creation is a distortion of what leftists always believed. Leftists were about historical progress. They were about making life better for the working class, about taking control of the major means of production, the banks, factories, and industries, in order to have a planned economy to make the world better for average working class people. And the left now is about something completely different. It's about some kind of weird spiritual thing. They're going to do drugs. They're going to listen to the Dalai Lama and learn about Tibet. And they're going to do yoga and sing Kumbaya. And they're going to make people be sensitive and nicer. And they're all going to sit in a circle. And I don't know what these people calling themselves left are, but that's not what leftism is about. You want to know what leftism is about? Read William Z. Foster. He was the leader of the Communist Party of the United States in the 1930s. just a brilliant intellectual working class person. He had many, many different jobs. He was a sailor for a long time. He worked with traveling theaters. I mean, he's just a beautiful, beautiful leader of the American working class, leader of the steel strikes. He wrote this beautiful book, Towards Soviet America, his vision of what a socialist USA would be like. And just a beautiful book. That's leftism. Leftism is about how can we make life better for people. It's not about destruction and chaos. It's not about some weird spiritual middle class worshiping of poverty. That is not leftism. Leftism is about moving ahead and building a better life for everyone. And leftism is about fighting against racism, and it's about making life better for women and overcoming the oppression of women. It's about getting rid of, barbaric oppressions. Absolutely. But it's not about inciting people against each other, and it's not about bringing people down. It's about bringing everyone up, starting, of course, with those who have suffered historically in our society. So let's be very clear about this, but there is a distorted middle-class trend that exists today that's calling itself left. And I would say at this point, what's so scary to me is that this fake left, these people masquerading as the left, walking around claiming that they are the left, are more supportive of war than the people on the right are. It's the right wing. It's Tucker Carlson who doesn't want us to bomb Syria. But it's people like Linda Sarsour, people like Democratic Socialists of America who want us to invade Syria. Why? Because it's make human rights and freedom. And, they learned at Harvard that, Assad is racist and sexist and homophobic, and we got to invade in order to make him more, this is scary stuff, right? At least, back in the days of the 1960s when you had that synthetic left emerge, at least they were against the Vietnam War. But now that's changed. Now the voices opposing war are coming from the right. They're isolationists. And in the aftermath of the Soviet Union and the fall of world communism, we have a situation emerging where people on the right wing are more critical of foreign policy than the left are. That leftism, and in fact, most interventions around the world, military interventions by the U.S. government, are justified in this weird and oddly left-wing sounding language, right? The USA invaded Afghanistan supposedly to free the women. Right? That was what it was about. It was a feminist operation. That's absurd. The conditions for women have gotten far, far worse now that the drug cartels are there and ISIS and terrorist groups and Al-Qaeda. And things are far worse for Afghan women, but the USA sold it like it was a girl power operation. Do folks remember during the Iraq War, they actually made a point of promoting this female soldier. There was this whole mini series about this female soldier who got captured by the Iraqis and all of that. It was really, really weird, And then nowadays, because communism is not the big current around the world, because most of the countries that are fighting the United States don't espouse Marxism-Leninism, because of that, left-wing themes are now used to justify interventions. Meanwhile, a lot of the governments that are opposed to imperialism, they are more socially conservative. Why? Because they preside over state-run economies, right? Syria, the banks, factories, and industries of Syria are controlled by the state. Iran, it's very much a state-run economy. China, Russia, these are state-run economies, and so they're offering people stability. They're saying, look, we can make sure that the economy keeps rising. We have this big state that's controlling the industries and controlling the economy. So they're offering stability. So in a weird way, because these anti-imperialist governments are offering stability to their populations, economic stability, they are becoming conservative, right? And they see the left as trying to create chaos, and they're having more of a conservative appeal. Look, we can keep things as they are. We can and you see a lot of, so it's very, very confusing. Leftism has been co-opted. Meanwhile, anti-imperialist governments present themselves as conservative more and more. So things have kind of flipped, but overall the struggle is the same. Wall Street and London and Western capitalism want a society where money rules. They want money to rule. They want the world to stay poor so they can maintain their monopolies. That's what Western capitalism and imperialism wants. Meanwhile, the countries around the world that are struggling against Western capitalism, they want the major centers of economic power to be controlled by society so that people can be raised up from poverty and that they can develop and they can move forward. So even if they are socially conservative, they're still left in that sense, right? They still want history to keep moving forward. They don't want the monopolistic stagnation of Wall Street and Western corporations to continue. And that's the weirdness of the situation that we're in. We're in a very strange situation, but ultimately the contradiction still exists. Western imperialism and the rule of monopolistic bankers and oil monopolies, in the West is battling to hold back development around the world and keep the world in a state of chronic poverty, keep the world poor so that Wall Street and London can stay rich. That's the battle of the 21st century. It was the battle of the 20th century. It's playing out. We live in crazy, crazy, crazy times. But let me take a drink of water here because there's so much to discuss. So much to talk about. You know, I know the Left Forum is coming up in New York City. I was invited to be on 2 different panels at the Left Forum, but actually I won't be able to make it because I'm going to Russia. I'm going to be in Moscow for a conference. So I thought I was going to leave the day after the Left Forum. Turns out I'm actually leaving on the day of the Left Forum, so I'll be out of town, so I won't be able to go to that conference. But the Left Forum is always an interesting place, I know some people are going to go there, and a lot of different forces calling themselves left. I mean, this is a really confusing world that we live in. A lot of things don't make any sense, but let's see what else we got to talk about. I wanted to talk about, there's all this talk about liberalism, and what is liberalism? And I wanted to back up because one of my biggest pet peeves is when people refer to neoliberals and they think that that means people in the Democratic Party. They think that means liberals. Neoliberalism is an economic school of thought. That's Milton Friedman, that's Ayn Rand, that's Ludwig von Mises. This is free market stuff. It's economic liberalism. It's neoliberal. It's a school of liberal economics that says that the government should step out of the economy. We should privatize things. That's what neoliberalism is. And furthermore, neoconservatism is a political current that emerged during the late Cold War. It was kind of a way of selling U.S. military operations around the world. You had Leo Strauss, Irving Kristol, and that was a political formation that's still quite powerful. And it was a lot of, people who studied Sovietology, they used to call it Sovietology, people that were trained to be Cold War diplomats. Neoconservatism is a political formation. Neoliberalism is an economic formation. And frankly, and this is going to get confusing, but it shouldn't be, the neocons, most neoconservatives or neocons actually advocate neoliberal economics. And that neoliberalism is an economic school of thought. Neoconservatism is a political strategy, and it's kind of a method. You saw the beginnings of it with Nixon, but it most especially escalated with Ronald Reagan. And the Bush administration was kind of the last hurrah. But, Leo Strauss, he was a professor of philosophy. He was very influential on people like Gene Kirkpatrick, Irving Kristol, Bill Kristol, editor of the Weekly Standard. And that a lot of these people that became very prominent in the Republican wing and also the Democratic wing of U.S. politics, mainly the Republican wing, especially in the 70s and 80s, that they were influenced by Leo Strauss and Irving Kristol, the former Trotskyist who became a right-wing conservative. That basically the way that they wanted average Americans to think about the world, the way Leo Strauss wanted average Americans to think about the world was like his favorite television program, Gunsmoke. It's an old 1950s TV show. In Gunsmoke, the good guy wears a white hat and the bad guy wears a black hat, and there's no question about who's good and who's bad. It's very, very clear, and it's a classic 1950s Western. The good guy wins in every episode, the bad guy loses in every episode, no moral ambiguity, not a very complicated plot. And Leo Strauss argued that that's how average Americans should be made to think about politics. The USA should be the good guy in an episode of Gunsmoke. And Leo Strauss, what kind of separated him from a lot of other, conservatives that had existed was he was very elitist. It was this idea that average people are too stupid to really have any say in politics, that they should just be manipulated, and that the idea that, there should be a class of rulers who rule over, he invoked Plato and Aristotle and talked about the philosopher kings. He told his students that they were superior, that they should rule over other people. And it was this kind of elitist conservative thinking that emerged. And it was kind of a break from some of the more traditional conservative stuff, the paleoconservatism, the more traditional right-wing thought in the United States. It was a break with it in a lot of ways. And it was, it was a neoconservative philosophy, the neoconservative movement. They advocated military intervention around the world, but it was about packaging. The liberals have advocated military interventions too, but it was about packaging it in a certain way, a certain kind of Cold War. When you used to see Reagan, he would get on TV and be like, the communists have taken one of our airplanes. I am going to have to go and rescue the people. It's a hard time. I'm Ronald Reagan. Nancy, what will I do? Yeah, it's probably a bad impression. But, it's that kind of thing, Oliver North kind of stuff. I mean, that Cold War, humanitarian intervention, good guys and bad guys, USA fighting the evil Reds, politics as a cowboy movie, and if you don't like it here, or if you have a political question, maybe you ought to move to some other country, and that the left are all just a bunch of pointy-headed intellectuals who don't understand the common man, and working men, hardworking men are conservatives who just want war all the time and like to drink beer, that political aesthetic, which isn't really around anymore, right? I mean, Trump is a break with that. In a lot of ways, Trump is more of a conservative populist, and he's got more of a conservative populist message. And the Democrats have never been this way. But neoconservatism has kind of a political formulation for U.S. politics. That's what neoconservatism is. So let's be clear that neoconservatism refers to a specific form of messaging in order to sell U.S. foreign policy and the Republican Party. And neoliberalism is an economic philosophy. It's free to choose by Milton Friedman, privatize everything, get the government off our backs. And they're not opposites of each other, and they're not directly tied to Republican and liberal. They're distinct formations, and that can get confusing. I should be more patient with folks, but I see people make that mistake a lot. But I'm having fun here. But folks, I want folks to ask me some more questions. Someone says, "Good guys wear red." Well, that's very funny. Someone likes my my imitation of Ronald Reagan. Well, thank you. I enjoy doing imitations. It's fun stuff. Good times. But yeah, no, folks, I got to tell you, we're living in some scary times. You wonder what's going to happen next. People are all worried about, I remember last week it was the royal wedding. I think everyone was all upset about the royal wedding and talking about that. But there's a lot happening in the world right now. And things are in a strange spot. One thing that I did see is that even though they're still in the middle of a war, people are dying and all of that, that Syria has already started up a natural gas field. That they started up a natural gas field already in an area that they reclaimed. All of a sudden, they started up a natural gas site, and that points again to the reason that they were attacked. Syria was trying to build an oil pipeline to connect the Islamic Republic of Iran to the Mediterranean. And they turned down, they would not cooperate with Saudi Arabia and Qatar to build an oil pipeline for them up into Europe. It's the Syrian government, the Ba'ath Arab socialist government, started by Hafez Assad, now continued by his son, Bashar Assad. That government has built hydroelectric power plants with the Soviet Union. They've worked to eradicate illiteracy in the country. They've worked to raise their population out of poverty. And that, the Ba'ath. Let's talk about Ba'athism, because there's a lot of confusion. So Ba'athism is a political movement in the Middle East, and it started in the 1930s. And it was started by a guy named Michel Aflaq. Michel Aflaq was a Syrian. He was actually from a Christian background. And he was a member. He joined the Communist Party in Syria. And that was at a time when Syria was a colony of France. And Michel Aflaq, he was a loyal communist. He studied Marx, and he was a Marxist. But he came to the conclusion that he had to leave the Communist Party. And that was because, at the time, Syria was a colony of France. And the main thing that Michel Aflaq and the Syrian communists were doing for a long time had been fighting against France and fighting for the independence of Syria. They didn't want Syria to be a colony. Well, then, when, the situation escalated with World War II and all of that, you got into a situation where, the communists and the Communist International was urging the Syrians to not emphasize the call for their freedom and not demonize the French, and to focus on anti-fascism and focus on demonizing the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese. And the attraction for so many Syrians to socialism, the entire basis, the only reason they were interested in communism to begin with, is they wanted to fight for their freedom and their independence. And so Michel Aflaq led a group of Syrians out of the Syrian Communist Party because they didn't agree with the Popular Front and the strategy of focusing on the fascists. They wanted to keep fighting for their independence from France. And so you had the formation of the Ba'athist movement, or Ba'ath movement. And Ba'ath actually means rebirth or resurrection. And the Ba'ath, they believed that there was one Arab people. The reason that throughout the Middle East you have all these different countries, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Syria, Iraq, it's one Arab nation. But those borders were drawn up by the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was a treaty not made by Arabs, but made by the British, primarily set by the British, but also including the French, the Russians, and some others. It was actually a secret treaty that was hidden until the Bolsheviks revealed it and made it public after the Russian Revolution of 1917. But basically, the Arab people, the one Arab nation, was carved up and divided by imperialism. And Baathism, as a political movement, argued that that could be undone, that they could build one united Arab nation on the basis of socialism and with, a planned economy, and that they studied Marx and they accepted certain aspects of Marxism, but they didn't really want to be part of the world communist movement. And most of the Baathist governments, Iraq and Syria, were aligned with the Soviet Union. They received economic assistance from the Soviet Union, but they did not consider themselves to be Marxists. The Baathist ideology was kind of adopted for the Arab people. They adopted a kind of a socialism that would apply to the Arab world and would be more in line with the Arab world. And that's what the Baathist political movement is. And the Syrian government is a Baathist government, and it comes out of this upsurge of Baathism and Baathist Arab socialism. And that's why it's being targeted, is that since the Baath Arab Socialist Party has taken power in Syria, they've been industrializing, and they've been trying to raise Syria up out of poverty, and they've been trying to construct and build things, and they worked with Russia to do it. They worked with China to do it. And that's why they're being targeted, is because they want to develop. They want to raise the country out of poverty. Hey, Caleb, this is Ronnie Miller. Hey, Caleb, I've got a question. How can we get all these kids that we see on Facebook to move away from revolutionary romanticism? Well, that's a very good question. Now, when you talk about revolutionary romanticism, now the term romanticism goes back to the time period, we're talking like the late 1800s, and there was this emphasis on emotion in art. Emotion, right? Not logic, but emotion. And you have, the music of like Richard Wagner, or Wagner, but I say it's Wagner is the correct German pronunciation. I like Wagner's music. It's fun to listen to. But, until Wagner, music had an intellectual appeal. If you listen to Mozart or Bach or Beethoven or Brahms, the music appeals not to your emotions, but to your intellect. You're hearing those notes go up and down, you're listening for patterns, and your mind is kind of picking up on the patterns in the music. But, in the Romantic period coming along, you have this emphasis on Wagner, where he's not trying to stimulate you intellectually, he's trying to stimulate you emotionally. And you've got this emphasis on emotion rather than intellect. And that changed everything. That was a change. And, art started to be like that as well, right? Art was said, well, you shouldn't, with art, appeal to people's intellect, you should appeal to people's emotions. And that romanticism is this belief that emotions should take precedent over rational thinking, that the rational part of the human mind, that emotions are what makes art beautiful, and that emotions are key. And so Ronnie Miller, when he talks about revolutionary romanticism, that's the thing. A lot of the people on the internet, who are attracted to left-wing politics, are attracted to it in a romantic way. They want to be Che Guevara. They want to be a hero. They see these paintings of these, revolutionaries. They watch Les Miserables, right? The musical, Do You Hear the People Sing? And they're running up on the barricades. And because of that, they can't address the key issues in the world economy in a rational way. For example, China is a socialist country. Yes, China is a socialist country. Socialism with Chinese characteristics. There are a lot of things in China that are not beautiful. China, they're trying to raise a country of 1 billion people out of poverty, and they're making great strides, and they're in a world dominated by Western capitalism. But there are a lot of things in China that aren't beautiful. And so you get these young romantic people, and they'll look at China and they'll see something they don't like. What is it? Maybe, homosexuality isn't widely accepted in China, or maybe, in China, the internet is censored, and they'll see that and they'll go, oh, that's not socialism. And their emotions take control, right? The idea that a country can be socialist and still have problems, that a country can be socialist and be in situations that are very different than we have in the West and have to make choices in ways that we don't like. They don't want that. Most of the people walking around calling themselves socialists or communists or anarchists nowadays have absolutely no interest in the Soviet Union, China, Cuba. They reject all of these societies. No, all of these societies are evil dictatorships. And that's because they're not thinking rationally. They're thinking emotionally. That socialism isn't heaven. You can't just create heaven. That socialism has come into the world. It's primarily come from deeply impoverished countries with very low levels of development that are being kept in chronic poverty by Western imperialism. And as a result of that, There's huge, mass illiteracy, mass hunger, and they have a revolution, and the people of that country come together and seize control of the economy, and they start building and they start constructing, and that is not easy, and it's not pretty, and it's very difficult, and a lot of things go on. We can't imagine the situation that these folks have gone through. I mean, if you look at what the Russian Revolution, what happened during that period, people who want to romanticize it, people who want to make it sound like it was just an action movie, it was Sylvester Stallone or something, that's really not reality. I mean, the kinds of things that people have to go through in the third world, the kind of things that people go through in revolutions, the kind of things that people that have established socialism and are trying to lift their country up have to go through are things that we can't imagine in the Western countries, right? I mean, because of imperialism, they've thrown us some crumbs here, and a lot of us in the Western countries have had a comfortable lifestyle, and we haven't really been able to understand what the majority of humanity has to go through. And so based on that, you look at a socialist country in the third world, and you see something you don't like, and you see some policy that they have or activity that they carry out, and you just go, oh my God, I don't want to be associated with that. I'm a true socialist. And that's the problem, and that's part of this romanticism. But what is actually happening in here, and I think this needs to be said, because there is a current of people who call themselves third worldists. The reality is the first world, especially the United States, is becoming third worldized. The kind of things that only used to happen in the third world are starting to happen in the Western countries right now. Look at what's happening. The standard of living is dropping. I'm just going to take another drink of water here in New York City while I point out, if you ever go to any third world country, they always tell you not to drink the water, right? That's very common. In the third world, they say don't drink the water, because, in the third world, the level of water purification is not what it is in the West, and so you're going to get sick. They call it Montezuma's revenge. Anyone ever been to Mexico? They talk about, don't drink the water, drink bottled water when you're in Mexico. You don't want to get Montezuma's revenge. Very racist. Montezuma was the leader of the Aztecs. That's a whole other story. But anyhow, well, what's happening all over the United States right now? Water all over this country is not being properly purified, right? We had that Flint water crisis where a whole bunch of children are going to be mentally disabled for their entire lives because they drank water that was not properly purified. What's a big problem they have in third world? You go throughout Latin America, South America, you go throughout Indonesia, you go to the Philippines, drug cartels. Heroin is all over. Go to Indiana. I mean, these drug cartels are everywhere. I mean, we're seeing gradually the United States and Western Europe be reduced to the conditions that the West has previously only imposed on the third world. What they used to call the labor aristocracy, or the aristocracy of labor, the idea that the working class of the first world, a big strata of it, would have this comfortable, happy life, and the third world would suffer, and this would come out of the third world. That's being systemically erased. And why is that? It's because they don't need an industrial working class in the first world anymore, right? It used to be that they bombed Korea, they bombed Vietnam, they bombed all these third world countries, and we, the United States, we made the world's cars, we made the world's steel. They bought it from us, and there was a strata, this strata of well-paid industrial workers in the Western countries who had, they made a decent amount of living. They had a house and a car and a comfortable life, and so because of that, the monopolism or the imperialism, it more or less benefited the white working class, not all the working class, but the white working class of the Western countries, right? The black working class was suffering, Latino workers were suffering, workers all over the world were suffering, but there was this strata, this labor aristocracy in the white Western world, among white workers in the Western world. We're living kind of a decent life, right? And that's been systemically erased, right? They don't need it because of technology, mainly. It's not simply outsourcing of jobs, but because of technology, they don't need that labor aristocracy any longer. They don't need a strata of white workers that are comfortable, that have a decent life. And because of that, we're seeing a controlled demolition of the labor aristocracy, of that comfortable layer of well-paid white workers in the Western countries. And that's what's happening in the United States right now. And we're seeing, the rise of kind of things that you only saw in the third world, in countries that were kept, in states of poverty by Western imperialism. We're starting to see a rise in them. The suicide rate is rising. One thing that I thought was interesting, and you have to be careful how you talk about this. You don't want people to think that that you're some kind of white supremacist or you're tied in with the alt-right. And I'm not saying that white people should have it better off. That's not my point at all. What I'm saying here, and this needs to be pointed out, is that this year, actually last year, 2017. was the lowest birth rate in the United States, and that's for all nationalities, mind you, black, Latino, white, the lowest birth rate in the United States, the lowest amount of births in the USA since 1987. People in the USA aren't having children. And why is that? Because if you grew up with a certain standard of living, you want to have children when you think you can provide for your children, right? That's what you want to do. You want to provide for your children. And right now, we're in a situation where millions of people in the United States, millions of people my age, like I'm 30 years old, born in 1987, and I'm one of those 1987 babies, that year that we had a low birth rate. And we, when you go to have children, you want to be able to provide for those children the same, or at least a decent economic standing. And if your standard of living has decreased, you're not going to have children because you want to provide for those children. You want the children that you have to be provided with a decent standard of living. And we're in a situation where people in the United States don't think that they can economically provide a good life for their children. People in the USA are not having children. It's very, very amazing what's happening in the USA right now. I mean, I've talked about something else that's happening in the USA right now. In 27 different states, you have towns and municipalities that are unpaving the roads. Unpaving the roads. Now, it might not even be, what they do is they take roads that have asphalt on them. And they have this device. It's actually a machine that you can buy. You import it into your state or your city, and it's called a reclaimer. And it pulls up the asphalt on the road, and it pulverizes it and turns it into dirt. So you replace a paved road with a dirt road. I mean, there was an article about this. There was a town in Vermont that was doing this. And the reason they were doing it was because this city was so in debt to the local banks that they could not afford to maintain asphalt roads. They couldn't maintain an asphalt road. So they unpaved the roads. When you're unpaving the roads, when you are taking roads that used to be asphalt paved roads and you're replacing them with dirt roads, you've got a very, very, very big problem. Okay, and anyone who thinks that, just because the stock market is riding high, the U.S. economy is doing well is completely delusional. I mean, we're unpaving the roads across the United States. People aren't having children. People are dying of heroin. The suicide rate is the highest it's been in a long time. Water isn't being properly purified. Things are falling apart. I mean, here in New York City, this is the financial center of the world. Wall Street is here. You wouldn't believe the big problems they're having with public transportation. The trains here are a complete wreck. I mean, it's just a joke. And furthermore, household debt is at record levels. People are having record levels of household debt. I mean, the U.S. economy is wrecked, and that labor aristocracy that made imperialism function, that layer of well-paid workers who were right-wing and nationalistic and supported all the wars because they had a decent living, that's being systemically demolished right now. And that's what leftists need to be asking themselves. And the primary beneficiary of that demolition of that strata of the white working class, the primary beneficiary has been the far right. Donald Trump, people like Richard Spencer, they talk about these issues, and they have benefited from it. The left doesn't talk about it. And on the left, there's this feeling that, that these white, workers, they're all racist, and that they maybe being poorer would be better. It would show them what, people in the third world have to suffer from. And that's a big problem because at this point, the idea that the ruling class has is they want to turn this anger of this recently dispossessed white working class into racism. And that's the idea, is, just make them angry and use that anger to, turn it against the black people, turn it against the immigrant community, turn it against the Muslims, and just kind of, hijack this anger among the white working class and utilize it to make them into just kind of a right-wing fighting force to beat down other nationalities. That's what they're trying to do. And the left, most of the left-wing forces based in coastal cities, you called me out about coastal cities, Julianne, thank you. Thank you, Julianne Collins. And they want to basically just hijack this anger. But anyway, so most of the left ignores this strata, the white working class is losing its standard of living, and basically has this attitude that they're racist, they're awful, they deserve to be suffering. They need to go to NYU, they need to be rich enough to go study, at a university and learn all about tone policing and white splaining, and there's just this idea that you shouldn't make an appeal. And furthermore, the appeal that is made is, like, for example, the term that gets thrown out there is like white privilege. And the idea is that white workers, this white working class that's seeing a drastic decline in their standard of living, should be told that they have it too good, right? That they're privileged, that they're too well off, that they've just had it too good. That's not a winning approach. No one ever wants to hear anyone tell them you've got it too good. Nobody ever wants to hear them being told that. And that was not the approach that built, the civil rights movement. And that, back in the time of the Communist Party, when they were strong, they went to white workers and they said, look, racism and the idea that black people should be treated badly and that you think you're superior to black people, that hurts you, because they use that to break your unions. Look at the South, the South, where they got the Klan and racism. As a result of that, they've got lower wages than people in the North, and the unions are weaker. And the Communist Party, people like William Z. Foster and Gus Hall, Eugene Dennis, Paul Robeson, they went to the working class and they said, look, racism is about hurting the entire working class by specially victimizing the black working class. The way that it was put by Karl Marx is, he said that white labor cannot be free when black labor is branded. And that was the idea, was that it was to the benefit of the entire working class to oppose racism, that racism was a plot by the Wall Street billionaires and monopolists. And furthermore, for the Communist Party back in the 1930s, there was an understanding that black nationalism, we're talking like Louis Farrakhan, the Nation of Islam, that black nationalism, that those were the allies of the white workers, that white workers were struggling against American capitalism, which was imperialism, and that black workers that said that we're a nation and we want to fight for ourselves on a nationalistic basis, that was also for the benefit of white workers. It wasn't just liberal anti-racism, that they supported black nationalism. That was the communist approach, was to support black nationalism. That's all been forgotten. It's all been forgotten. The left now approaches white workers saying, you've got it too good. You should be ashamed of yourself. You should be poorer so you know how other people have it. That's not a winning approach. And, because I point this out, and because I critique this, and because so many of the people that I grew up with, I'm from a small town in Ohio, so many people that I grew up with are for Trump now, right? And the small town I'm in, the area I've grown up in, it's been devastated by heroin and all of this stuff, and no one cares about it, right? The only people trying to make an appeal to these people's anger are the far right. The left just says, oh, they're just a bunch of racist hillbillies, who cares about, and that is a disaster. We need class solidarity. We need the white workers who are losing their jobs and are angry about heroin and are seeing their neighbors destroyed by heroin to see that the black working class that is struggling against racism is their ally. And I think that one of the key issues to do that around is the race question. Why? Because a lot of white workers now are being beaten up by police. A lot of white workers are seeing these police raids in their neighborhood. And you know why they're getting away with doing it to white people on so many levels? Because they've gotten away with doing it to black people for so long. For years, black people suffered under police brutality. Black people were being terrorized by the police. For years, they were being terrorized, and so many of the white workers just said, oh, he must have deserved it. I used to get so angry when I would talk to people, because for every case of police brutality, you talk to so many white people, somehow the person deserved it, right? The cop can just shoot somebody completely randomly, but somehow the police were right and the victim was wrong. Every time they sit there and make an excuse because racism can't be real in their minds. And it was so tragic to watch. And it's because of that attitude, because white people didn't challenge police brutality when it was happening to black people. Now, as the economy falls apart, things are getting worse. Things are getting worse. The economy is getting worse and conditions are getting worse. And now we're seeing an escalation of police brutality, not just against black people, against white people. And what they did to the black people yesterday, they are doing to white workers today. That's the reality, and that's what people need to hear, and that's what people need to understand. Is that racism hurts everyone, and what they do to the black people today, they can do to you tomorrow. What they do to the immigrant workers today, they can do to you tomorrow. That this is how it works, and that if you go along with it, and if you celebrate the oppression of one group of people, then they're going to do it to you next, and they're going to get away with it. Whenever you're expanding the power of the ruling elites of the United States to oppress people, to imprison people, to terrorize people. Whenever you expand that power, you are putting yourself in danger. That is what needs to be recognized. That's class solidarity. Police brutality against black people is not good for white people. And that's what needs to be understood. And as long as the attitude is that police brutality against black people is somehow good for white people, I mean, I see a lot of these posts, and people have the right to say it. People absolutely have the right to say it, that, you know, the police are much harder on black people. The police brutality against black people is far, far worse than it is against white people. But why is it that so often when there is police brutality against a white person, the response isn't, see, what's happened to black people for so long is now happening to white people. The response instead is, oh, you know, oh, look, now it's like people just don't want solidarity. There's just this drive against solidarity. I don't understand it. I really don't understand it, you know. Julianne Collins is writing in about, you know, the Gaza and the situation there. I mean, come on, they're murdering people, right? I mean, we saw people getting shot down. I mean, that was an intense situation. Thanks for speaking up there, Julie. You know, I mean, all over the world, we are seeing capitalism in a crisis. And it's really an economic question because, you know, in this high-tech economy with the emergence of artificial intelligence, we're seeing a situation where they don't need industrial workers. You know, I was in Russia at the Valdy Discussion Club, which is an important think tank and discussion club in Russia. It's located near Sochi, but it's up in the mountains. I was at the World Festival of Youth and Students, and I got the opportunity to go up to the Valdy Discussion Club. George Galloway was there. Peter Lavelle, the host of Crosstalk, a very good show on RT, was there. And I was at Valdy Discussion Club, and I remember I got to hear there was a panel. It was Hamid Karzai, Vladimir Putin, and also on the panel was the billionaire Jack Ma. And I got to be in the same room, Vladimir Putin, Hamid Karzai, Jack Ma, small room up there. And I remember I got to listen to Jack Ma's presentation. And Jack Ma was talking about artificial intelligence. And one of the things he said is that, you know, we train people to be like machines. You know, but right now, basically, we have machines that can be like people. And he was referring to the fact that basically, you know, throughout the educational system, when you go to school, you know, what they're training you to do is to be a good factory worker. I mean, I went to school in a small town in Ohio, the place where Smucker's jelly comes from. There was also a Smith dairy plant. And they're basically training you to be a good factory worker, right? You came in, you had to be there on time, you had to be working the whole time. If you were at your desk and you weren't working, a teacher would say, why aren't you working, right? You don't want to be wasting the company's time. And you're being trained to be a good industrial worker. Well, now we're in a situation where everything that people used to do can be done by a machine. And I mean, that's like, even we're talking about like playing chess, for example, right? Machines can play chess better than people can at this point, right? Machines can play chess better than people. Machines can invest on the stock market better than people. And so we've been training people to try and be like robotic machines, right? You know, take orders, you know, and be robotic. And that's how our educational system is set up, you know, and some of the more authoritarian aspects where the kids are all marching in a line and all of that. I mean, that's all because we're training people to be industrial workers. It has a rational purpose, but we're in a situation where we don't need industrial workers, right? And so the only thing that separates human beings now is what makes us human, right? Machines can't have souls. Machines can't understand cause and effect. Very interesting article about that. Machines just can't get cause and effect. They just don't get it, right? They can't tell if the rooster crows because the sun comes up or if the sun comes up because the rooster crows. They don't get it. They can detect that they happen at once, but this ability to be rational and to be creative and to reason, that's what separates human beings from machines. That's what we have that machines do not have. That's all we've got, mind you. That's all we've got is what makes us human. So we're going to have to change our educational system. We can't keep training people to be like robots and to be like machines because machines can do everything that machines can do, and machines can do a lot of what people can do, right? That we're going to have to change our relationship to the means of production and our relationship with education. And that basically technology is pointing toward the future. But all of this can only happen. Things can only change if we take control of our economy. The banks, factories, and industries, the major centers of economic power, the oil wells, the steel production, all of the centers of production must be organized rationally. We must have a planned economy. With capitalism, you can't do it. Now, people are asking, I see Ronnie Miller and others are asking me about universal basic income. I want to talk about that. I'm going to address that right now because, you know, there's a big push for universal basic income, and in principle, it's a good idea. And one interesting thing is one of the biggest advocates of universal basic income was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon advocated that. And you can read my recent article about Richard Nixon and the forces who moved against him, and how Richard Nixon was not an advocate of neoliberalism in a lot of ways. He kicked Milton Friedman out of the White House, and that he, in order to carry out his kind of strongman agenda, he needed this base among the white working class, these hard hats. And so to protect them, he blocked neoliberalism in a lot of ways. But that's beside the point. But universal basic income, in theory, it's a good idea. Here's my question with it. My question with universal basic income is if you read about universal basic income, in some ways, it's an austerity program. You read, one of the biggest advocates of universal basic income is this guy, Charles Murray. And he's the guy who wrote The Bell Curve, this awful racist book arguing that people are differently intelligent based on their race, not peer-reviewed, not studied, but it was being widely promoted in the 80s. But Charles Murray, you read articles by him advocating universal basic income, and he says, look, if we just give everybody, everyone below a certain income level, just give them $2,000 every month or $1,000, whatever it is every month, just deposit a universal basic income in all these people, then we can get rid of food stamps, and we can get rid of Section 8. And we can get rid of, TANF and aid to dependent families. And we can get rid of, the social we can get rid of all these programs, and everyone just gets an electronic bank deposit in their account. And we can lay off thousands and thousands of government workers who organize the welfare state, right? And we can just shrink the government and get rid of all these government jobs, and we can put a lot more people in a situation where they're going to be dependent on universal basic income. And furthermore, if all people get is universal basic income, right? They don't get all these different programs, food stamps, Section 8 for their rent, all these basic programs are gotten rid of, right? And all they get is a bank transfer, then it's very easy to make it go away, right? So if somebody gets a drug conviction, we can't have the government give people money if they're using drugs. Cut off. They lose everything, right? They don't just lose one thing, they lose it all, right? So there's some problems with universal basic income. There's some questions there, and that there is a section of the American elite that sees universal basic income. They basically see it as a what you might call an austerity program, and it's a way to get rid of the huge public sector, right? They can get rid of all these complex social programs by just having a artificial intelligence electronic bank account, dump money in people's accounts, and it's much easier to just kick people off of it, right? Because they're all in one program. There's not a million different programs. That's a problem I have with universal basic income. But a lot of countries have it. Scandinavian countries and stuff, and it's not. People have this idea that if there's a universal basic income, no one's going to ever work, and that's kind of ridiculous. This idea that no one would ever get a job; they would all just live off universal basic income. Is not. You're not rich living off universal basic income. No one's getting super rich off of it. But let me take another drink of water here. Universal basic income is an interesting idea, but there's different ways to come at it. I think we do need to point out, and I really do want to point out, that universal basic income is not socialism. That socialism is public control over the means of production. It's when the economy does not function according to profits. And that redistribution of wealth is not socialism. And that's a really common misnomer. People say, well, socialism is when the government redistributes wealth. No. Every government ever redistributes wealth. The roads outside of this building are paid for with wealth and tax dollars that are redistributed, right? Some governments redistribute a lot of wealth. Some governments redistribute a little bit of wealth, but governments always redistribute wealth. That is not what socialism is. Socialism is not the redistribution of wealth. Socialism is when the banks and factories and industries are rationally organized and organized according to a central plan. And you can have a high level of income inequality in a socialist society, or you can have, capitalist societies with very little income inequality, right? The income inequality, that's this big social democratic thing, income inequality, that's not what socialism and capitalism are about. Capitalism does create income inequality, but more than that, it creates wealth inequality. Income is just about the money you've got coming in. But the issue is who owns the banks, who owns the factories, who owns the centers of economic power. And not only who owns them, but how are they operated? Are they operated for the benefit of society, or are they operated so a small group of people can make money and make profits? And that's the difference between capitalism and socialism. And I want to be absolutely clear on that. But folks should ask some more questions. Let's keep talking here. I really do think, back to the question that Ronnie Miller raised, he talked about romanticism, and that is one of the biggest problems, is that, with entertainment and media right now, they are really encouraging people to be just completely emotional, to just completely let your emotions run rampant, right? You know, every TV commercial, every advertisement, everything is it's sex and aggression and emotions, right? Everyone's plucking your heartstrings. And I think that that might be why there's so much cynicism in the world today. That's might be why people are so cynical, is because everyone is trying to manipulate their feelings and emotions. And if everyone is trying to manipulate you, you pretty soon, it's kind of like, you know, the little boy who cried wolf, where you just, you know, you stop believing them because they lied so many times. You know, that's the situation that we've got. But there's more to it than that, I think. And the thing is that when you're emotional, right? When you're loaded with emotion, you're not thinking rationally. When you're sexually aroused, you're not thinking rationally. When you're filled with anger and violence, you're not thinking rationally. And that rational thinking is what separates us from animals, that human beings have the ability to think rationally, not just to think emotionally. And while emotions make great art and they're fun to experience, and art is great at, you know, I mean, I'm not against Wagner music, I'm not against emotional movies and stuff, but we need to recognize that there's such a de-emphasis on anything intellectual in the world today, that it's getting to be very scary, and that people's emotions are being so widely manipulated by the media and by everything. Everywhere you go, there's advertisements bombarded at you, and music playing, and naked people on billboards, and everything. I mean, it's every effort is made to just kind of manipulate people emotionally, to the point that rational thinking doesn't go on. And when I walk through the streets and ask people, you know, where North Korea is on a map, and most of them can't find it, you know, why do you think that is? Why do you think that is? I mean, it's like everyone's emotions are cranked up, and when your emotions get cranked up, the rational part of your mind gets lowered. And that's one of the problems that we have, that rationalism and rational thinking is being ratcheted down. So Zen Yassin writes, I want healthcare and education to be free for everyone and cut all the programs. That's interesting. I don't know how you would get healthcare and education for everyone and cut all the programs. But that's, I mean, yeah, why shouldn't people be able to see a doctor when they're sick? I can't think of a reason that people shouldn't be able to see a doctor when they're sick. I can't think of a reason that people shouldn't be able to get education, right? I mean, most countries in the world, people can get a college education without getting into debt. You know, I mean, you know, God, you got to love, you know, these Ayn Rand types, you know, and they talk about, well, healthcare isn't a right, a job isn't a right. You know, it's just scary stuff. You know, libertarianism in a lot of ways is politicized sociopathy. That's what I believe, right? If you read Ayn Rand's writings, Ayn Rand, in her book, The Fountainhead, the hero is Howard Rourke, and he's this architect who no one understands him because he's so creative in how he builds his buildings. Howard Rourke goes out and rapes a woman. He rapes her. And that's portrayed as a heroic act. It's somehow a good thing. I mean, Ayn Rand is a rape apologist. Her novel, The Fountainhead, portrays rape as a good thing. But yet it's so widely promoted. Paul Ryan says Rand Paul is the one who, or not, Paul Ryan says Ayn Rand is the one who inspired him. You know, and you know, objectivism, Atlas Shrugged, all this stuff is out there, and this is politicized sociopathy. You know, Ayn Rand, there's a very good book about, Goddess of the Market, Ayn Rand and the American Right. And it talks about how when Ayn Rand first moved to the United States from the Soviet Union, when she was living in Chicago, she became a great admirer of William Hickman. And this was a Chicago guy who strangled his wife, murdered his own wife. A guy kills his own wife. Ayn Rand was just in awe of this man. She loved this guy who strangled his own wife. And this is the woman who is the writer that all of these Republicans and conservative members of Congress love, is this woman who admires wife stranglers and promotes rape in her novels. Why do they like it? It's essentially what it's about is that this is politicized sociopathy. This is promoting the thinking of psychopaths. And Ayn Rand's ideology of objectivism is she argues that altruism and caring about other people is the source of all evil, and that people should be selfish. She actually has a compilation of essays called The Virtue of Selfishness. And when someone tells you they're a libertarian, you know, I mean, a lot of people are confused. I remember, you know, at the time the Tea Party was coming, a lot of people were like, I'm a libertarian because I don't like the Democrats or the Republicans. They didn't know any better. But at the essence of what libertarianism is, you know, on the left, there's this belief, you know, economically people should be taken care of. On the right, there is this kind of like one should live their life in a moral way. One should follow religion and tradition. Libertarianism destroys both the left and the right and says selfishness. Do whatever you want. Just be a selfish person. Only think about yourself. Don't think about anyone else. Who cares if you have to victimize other people in the process? You can get ahead, step on other people, be selfish, exploit other people, make lots of money. Who cares about poor people? Let them die. They're inferior. Use lots of drugs. That's libertarianism. That is evil. It is just evil. In a right-wing sense, it's evil because you're not following conventional rules and you're just acting selfishly and you don't have any obligation to society. In a left-wing sense, it's evil because you don't want to do anything economic. You just want to not take care of anybody. You want poor people to just die of hunger because they deserve it, because they're not as amazing as you are or something like that. Libertarianism is just doctrinaire definition of evil. In all societies, we've said that people that are like that, people that say they have no obligation to anyone else and are purely selfish, in every society in history, you go to ancient Rome, Mesopotamia, ancient India, ancient civilizations, it's always been understood that that is the definition of evil, that psychopaths are evil. That's evil, right? Those who kill other people because they feel like it, because why should they feel sorry for somebody? That is evil. Libertarianism, the philosophy behind it, objectivism, is the textbook definition of evil. That's what it is. It is evil. And that is what's being promoted from the highest levels of government. People want to tell you how bad Stalin is or how bad Mao is. I mean, I'll tell you, I don't know of any society in history where they have actually sold and promoted the writings of somebody who admired rapists and axe murderers, right? I've never heard of that, right? No matter how bad some dictator or some ruler is around the world, I've never heard of any dictator who promoted and encouraged people to read the writings of axe murderers and rapists and wife stranglers. But the fact that Ayn Rand and her beliefs are everywhere in this country, in the United States of America, shows that there are some really sinister forces that have a lot of power in the United States of America. Some very, very sinister forces are in power in the USA, right? I can't think of any society in the world. I mean, even if you're just a rational, say you were some kind of dictator, you're the emperor of Rome, right? Your job is to make sure that Romans are not killing each other, so they all follow you. You wouldn't promote Ayn Rand's writings. The promotion of Ayn Rand's writings, the fact that the works of this insane psychopath are being promoted everywhere in the USA, shows that we are a deeply, deeply, deeply unhealthy society. That must be said. And the fact that we have these mass shootings and these people are going to schools and shooting up and killing people, you can't separate it. I don't think you can separate those two things. The fact that we have the writings of someone who admired murderers and rapists being widely distributed, and we have Americans going and shooting and murdering their classmates and their schoolmates and killing each other at these unprecedented rates, I don't think you can separate those two things. That free market ideology, the philosophy used to justify the capitalist system and the free market system, I believe that has a lot to do with why there's a lot of mass murder and killing in the United States right now. Must be said. And, people say, well, Ayn Rand's just a writer, Caleb. This is just a writer, she appeals to certain people. Oh, no. Alan Greenspan. Do you know the name Alan Greenspan? The guy who was the head of the Federal Reserve for like 20 years, starting in the 80s up into like the 2000s, right? Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan was Ayn Rand's protege. He was her personal friend. He lived with Ayn Rand at one point. They were very, very, very close. Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan was also the head of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is foreign relations up into the 80s. It was one of the most powerful think tanks of U.S. foreign policy. When Alan Greenspan got his first job, and that was in the White House of Gerald Ford, when he got his first job in the White House of Gerald Ford after Nixon had been driven out because Nixon wouldn't play ball with neoliberalism, as right-wing and awful as Nixon was, he wouldn't play ball with them. After Nixon was driven out, and when Gerald Ford came in, he brought Alan Greenspan into the White House, and Alan Greenspan brought Ayn Rand with him, and she stood next to him while he took the oath. Alan Greenspan went on to be one of the most powerful people in the U.S. economy. This is the guy who essentially crashed our economy in 2008, 2009, legalized all kinds of lending practices that had been outlawed because they would lead to a financial crash. Alan Greenspan, one of the most powerful people in the U.S. economy. This was Ayn Rand's protege. This is Ayn Rand's protege. Some people suspect her boyfriend, right? And that we handed our economy, the Federal Reserve, which is supposed to be the institution that keeps us from having economic crashes, we handed that over to a follower of Ayn Rand, the axe murderer admiring, rapist glorifying novelist who thinks that human beings shouldn't care about each other and people should be purely selfish. right? This is deeply unhealthy. There are big problems in the United States of America. Sorry to be Mr. Negative here, because you can get all negative about all of this, but there are good things happening in the world too. I mean, I keep going over to Eurasia. I keep going over to Russia. I mean, good things are happening. Construction projects are happening. Scientific achievements are happening. A space program is happening. A lot of very amazing things are happening in the world right now. I'm actually going to recite a poem here, and I got to forgive folks that are familiar with my work have probably heard it before. But before I do that, I'm going to look at Tom Linscott's comment here. He says, emotions are manipulated by the media, yet few people today have control over their emotions, or what is termed emotional intelligence. They can have great knowledge and high IQs, but emotionally intelligent morons. Thus, we have a lot of divorces, depression, suicide, and crimes of passion. I think you're exactly right, Tom. I think you're exactly right. That controlling one's emotions is a very important skill. And that unfortunately we live in this world where a lot of young people, they don't have the ability to control their emotions, and I will say that it's partially the fact that the media is pushing this romanticism constantly and trying to manipulate our emotions. But furthermore, I would say that the issue is that, things have changed. The culture has changed. People don't feel any obligation to each other. We have social media, which is all about you are so important. There's a lot of issues here, but when I was and Julianne Collins is asking me what Putin is like. I've been in Putin's presence on 3 different occasions. I was in the same room as Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is the most smooth speaker that I've ever seen. He doesn't stutter. He doesn't pause. He is just smooth. He is the smoothest speaker I've ever seen. And he talks with like this pure confidence when he speaks. And, there's all this stuff out there. Let's talk about who Vladimir Putin is. So Vladimir Putin was a student, right? He came out of, I know he was in the security services of the Soviet Union, the KGB, but he was a student in the 1990s. He was studying. I believe he got his PhD. And this was the 1990s when Russia's economy was just crashing. It was just, it was just falling apart. You had BP in there, wrecking the place. All their collective farms were shutting their doors. People were going hungry, mass death. They lost like 10% of their population. People either fled or just died. Heroin, suicide, awful. They had like 30% unemployment at some points during the 1990s. Russia really suffered during the fall of the Soviet Union, right? I know everyone thinks that they were free and they love capitalism, but things actually were particularly bad. Actually, there's a very good book that documents this called Europe. It's right over here, Europe Since 1989. And it kind of gets into the statistics of that. So the economy of Russia was very bad in the 1990s. So Vladimir Putin, former member of the KGB, he's studying at the university, and he writes a PhD thesis arguing that the way to rescue Russia's economy is to create what he calls national champions. And these are super mega state-controlled corporations. And he basically argues that, Russia, they have a huge amount of oil, they have a huge amount of natural gas. And so if he could create 2 mega corporations, 2 national champions, 2 state-controlled entities, that could be used to reboot their economy, and they could center their economy around national champions. And Putin, he studies Marx to write about this, but to be fair, he also studies Adam Smith, and he studies, economic theories, all kinds of economic theories about how to use mega corporations controlled by the state in order to reboot the economy. That's what he writes about. And he writes about this. You can read his thesis. It's on the internet. And it's a very carefully, well-researched economic document, very scientific, in which he writes, as a student, as an academic, he writes, this is my theory about how to fix up Russia's economy. And then he runs for president, and he gets elected. And from office, from the time he's elected up until, 2006, from like 1999 until 2006, he gradually puts it into practice, and he moves to, absorb all the private oil companies or the private natural gas companies into 2 giant mega corporations, Gazprom and Rosneft. There's a state-controlled oil company and a state-controlled natural gas company that basically have virtual monopolies. And by doing that, by creating these mega corporations, he actually fixes Russia's economy, and the standard of living vastly improves. Right? So this is a guy who he academically studied how to fix up Russia's economy. He took office, and from the presidency, and he was able to do it. That is statecraft. That's leadership. And that's something that we're lacking here in the United States. You know, Putin got elected on the basis of fixing up the economy, and he studied and scientifically, and he used his rational mind, and he pulled it off. And, you know, Putin himself, he does emphasize, you know, this whole thing about not letting your emotions run rampant and thinking rationally. I mean, he's a guy who does it. I mean, you see him when you're in the same room with him, absolutely controlled, totally smooth. But, you know, Putin is not, I mean, he represents a wider section than himself. You know, there is a vast bureaucracy in Russia. You know, the Soviet Union collapsed, but at the time there were a lot of people in the Russian state bureaucracy, you know, in the government-controlled industries, you know, in the leadership of the Communist Party, in various, you know, the military, the security services there. There were a lot of people who didn't like what was happening to the country in the 1990s and wanted to stop it. And Putin represented, when he took office, that strata within Russian society that wanted to save the country from the economic demolition that was being carried out by Jeffrey Sachs and the IMF and Bill Browder. Bill Browder, now he's the Russian expert on CNN, you know, the grandson of Earl Browder, the sellout, you know, traitor to the Communist Party USA here in the USA. You know, Vladimir Putin, very much, he took office on the platform of fixing up Russia's economy, and he did it. He did fix up the economy of Russia. So let's see what else is going on here. Statecraft, like I said, you know, I feel like, you know, people that are left and want to call themselves Marxists, they're very familiar with the history of socialism and communism, but, you know, human civilization goes back a lot further than 1917. It really does. And, you know, we need to talk about what has been successful in past civilizations and what has been unsuccessful. And you know, one thing that I think can stand out, you know, is, you know, let's talk about the difference between the Renaissance and the Dark Ages, because they were right next to each other. You had the Dark Ages, and then suddenly you had the Renaissance. What was the difference? What changed between these two epochs, right? Because they basically had the same, you know, political setup. They had feudalism, they had kings, they had serfs, they had peasants. What was the difference between the Renaissance and the Dark Ages that preceded them? Well, the difference is this. In the Renaissance era, you had serfs, you had peasants, you know, and there was this feeling that human beings, for the most part, existed to serve what you would call, what was then at that point called their natural superiors, right? That if you were a peasant, you existed to serve, you know, the local landlord. The commoners existed to serve the king, and that's why human beings existed. And what changed is in the Renaissance, you know, when you had kind of some breakthroughs in education and science. Very good point, Mimi, about education. And there suddenly became a shift in what should rulers do. And suddenly there was this feeling in Italy, in Britain, in France, and a lot of places in Western Europe that instead of just people serving their natural superiors, that there was also this obligation on the part of the leadership to serve the people or the population. That the population, the leadership or the rulers had an obligation in their leadership, that they had an obligation to serve the people. And you had the emergence of what you might call the nation state and the Treaty of Westphalia. And there was this idea that the leaders of the world, of these countries, of these nation states, had an obligation to their people, right? And that's what changed things. And that's how you got, you know, Galileo. And that's how you got, you know, people like Leonardo da Vinci. You got, you know, in Britain, you got the Tudor monarchy that was eventually ended up being the people who you know, created capitalism in Britain. But in the lead up to that, they did construction projects and they funded education. They were teaching people all over Britain how to read. Henry VII, you know, he was doing a lot. You know, the Tudor monarchy was kind of a game changer when they came in because they had this new Renaissance idea for statecraft, that the state has an obligation to the people. That the government ought to be making life better for people, that people shouldn't serve the government, that the government should serve the people. That was the changing point. And the concept of the people or populism can really be traced back to that time period. You know, to that, it was that time period that you got this kind of conception of serving the people. Now, some people say, and it could be argued that you saw it a little bit earlier in, you know, in the Roman Empire a little bit with, you know, the Roman monarchs wanting to serve the people of the city of Rome. In ancient Greece and Athens, you saw some of that, and, you know, Plato's The Republic and all of that. But really the Renaissance, what made it different than the Dark Ages was that in the Renaissance era, you saw the rise of what you might call modern statecraft, this idea that the government should serve the population. So now Mimi is asking me to suggest a good book. There's a lot of good books to read out there. I mean, a lot of good reading to do, and I'm constantly reading. I mean, this is just a fraction of my bookshelf. I'm not going to show you my apartment right now because, I'm not going to show you my whole life, but it's full of books. I've got lots of books, and people should be reading. If you want a really good book to read, one thing you should read is you ought to read my book. You ought to read Getting Rich Without Capitalism, America's Way Out. So I'll recommend my own book. That's the book you should be reading. But also, if you really want to understand, modern Marxist thinking, you want to understand how people who are Marxists and are applying Marxist principles and applying that principle of statecraft, I would recommend you read the writings of President Xi Jinping. I mean, this is the leader of the People's Republic of China. This is an expert on Marxism, someone with a degree in Marxism, a brilliant thinker who is leading the largest country in the world in terms of population, the second largest economy in the world. I would recommend reading, there's 2 volumes now, volumes 1 and 2, The Governance of China. He's going to have a book on Karl Marx that's going to come out based on his presentation he just gave. I know he has like a memoir, which is, I don't think it's available in English yet, but it's his memoir of how he grew up and how he came into prominence in the party. Anything you can read by Xi Jinping is very good. Now, Julianne Collins, she recommends Chris Hedges, and I do. I mean, I work with Chris Hedges. I see him around the RT office in New York City. Brilliant man. We've had many great discussions. I don't agree with him on everything. He doesn't agree with me on everything. We had many great discussions. I know he did a lot of work in the Middle East. He reported from Iraq for the New York Times, and I've been over to Iran. I've spent a lot of time in Iran, so we've actually had some good discussions. Chris Hedges is a great guy. I recommend him, and I recommend his TV program. He has a lot of good guests on his show. But what other books can I recommend? There's so much. I'm just looking over at my bookshelf. I mean, I personally, one book that I recommend, it's like, this is like a mirror here. I'm reaching for the wrong side. But, if you really want to know, some of the beautiful stuff that went on in the history of socialism, I would recommend Anna Louise Strong. She's really one of my favorite writers. And this is her book on the United States, My Native Land. But she wrote beautiful books about, she was an American from a wealthy family, and she went to the Soviet Union in the 1920s. And she was very excited about what she saw, and so she started going back. And she wrote these beautiful books interviewing average people in the Soviet Union. And then later she went to China, and she wrote about what was happening with Mao and the Chinese Revolution. She actually interviewed Mao, and in the little red book, Quotations from Chairman Mao, there's actually quotations from her interview with Mao. And she was a great writer, Anna Louise Strong, and she actually went to the Soviet Union. She was kicked out of the Soviet Union. She was back in the USA in the 50s. And then later she went to China, and she actually died in China. And she was a very good personal friend of Zhou Enlai, who was a leader of the People's Republic of China. And she died in China. A very interesting writer. And there's a very good biography of Anna Louise Strong. It's called Right in Her Soul. Because it's interesting, Anna Louise Strong, she's from a very religious family. She went to Oberlin College in Ohio, and her father was a minister. And you wouldn't think that that's the case for a communist or somebody who's associated with Marxism, but she doesn't see a contradiction. And if you read her autobiography, which I also recommend, I don't have it here, I Change Worlds. If you read, Anna Louise Strong's autobiography, I Change Worlds, she talks about how her background in kind of the Protestant, Christian faith, what you might call mainline Protestantism. She talks about how that actually led her toward understanding socialism and becoming a Marxist. A brilliant writer, Anna Louise Strong. And, it's interesting for me because, Anna Louise Strong is from Ohio, went to Oberlin College. I'm actually from Ohio as well. And, it's interesting. My mother's maiden name is Finney, Finney. An individual who is very pivotal in the history of Ohio and also in the history of the United States is probably my ancestor, and that's Charles G. Finney. And he was the founder of Oberlin College, and he was the minister, a Christian minister, who was the leader of what was called the Second Great Awakening. And this was a religious upsurge in the United States, and it took place in the 1800s, and it was an upsurge of people in the USA, kind of an upsurge of religious fervor, but it was progressive. It was anti-slavery. It was starting to criticize capitalism. And this guy, Charles G. Finney, who ended up being the founder of Oberlin College, he was himself a Christian minister, but he was very radical, very anti-slavery. He was helping to set up the Underground Railroad in Ohio, and he was just a very radical guy. And he's the guy who actually kind of pioneered what they call the Christian revival meetings. where, the tent revivalism, and he wrote even a handbook for it. And this guy, Charles G. Finney, is, he's very, very key. And if you want to understand the United States, you have to go back to the Second Great Awakening, like Mormonism, for example. Mormonism is a big deal. Where I grew up in Ohio, not really a big deal anymore. But, out in Utah, Idaho, Arizona, New Mexico, Mormonism is a big deal. Well, Mormonism, when it began back in the 1800s, not today, when it began, Mormonism was a pretty radical belief system. The Mormons, they held everything in common. They had kind of a utopian socialism where they shared everything, and they were very anti-slavery. And in fact, they even had a group, the Mormons had, you can look this up, called the Avenging Angels. And these were armed Mormons who went around killing slaveholders. They were radicals. The Mormons were radicals back in the day. And they were opposed to slavery. They were opposed to the existing status quo. They were trying to build some kind of socialistic commune. The Mormons have a very interesting history. One thing that you have to wrangle with, and people get mad at me for that, because, when I first got into left-wing politics, I was very angry at the way things were in the USA, and you could call me "quote unquote" anti-American. I remember I was someplace and we were chanting, "We are not Americans, we are proletarians." That's not helpful. That's not helpful. I'm born here from the United States of America. I'm from a small town in Ohio. I'm an American. Everything about me is American. I went to church on Sunday when I was a kid. Everyone in my town voted Republican. I remember I learned to shoot a shotgun when I was a kid, right? That's pretty American. And I'm not going to comment on the gun control issue, but, I learned to shoot a shotgun when I was a kid. And that if we want to change the United States of America, which I think is something that is our obligation, we need a better society here in the USA. We need to come to be at peace with the United States of America. We need to know who the American people are. This is a very big country. I always tell people when I go overseas, 90% of the time when you see the USA on TV, you're seeing New York City or Southern California. But the USA is a very big country. We got 50 states. It's got a lot of different aspects to its culture. And that if we really want to make a better life for the people in the USA and for the people of the world, we want to get rid of this system of global monopolist imperialism, we need to understand the American people. We need to understand who we are and understand the psychology of the people of the United States of America. And if we just want to rage against them and be like, oh, they're awful and this is a racist colonial society and I want nothing to do with it, that's some of that romanticism we've been talking about here, and that might feel good and that you might, get your anger out, but you're not really going to change the world, That's why I'm increasingly interested in Michel Aflaq and Ba'ath Arab socialism, because Michel Aflaq, he said that, the Arab people were not going to adopt the Soviet Marxist-Leninist styles politics. And he developed Ba'ath Arab socialism as a kind of socialism that fit with the Arab people. Michel Aflaq, like I said, he was from a Syrian Christian background, but he embraced Islam because he understood that Islam was the psychology of the Arab people, that Muhammad and Islam came out of Arab culture, and he came to understand that. And that people in the United States who are socialists, they need to understand the American people, and they need to come to terms with what it means to be an American. And how can we find a socialism that will be rooted in the American people? How can we find a socialism that the American people will embrace as their own? Because right now, if you talk to people in the USA about socialism and communism, they think it's a foreign thing. They think socialism, that's Russian or Korean or Chinese. And I can guarantee you that Korean socialism, Russian socialism, Chinese socialism, Swedish socialism, socialism from Denmark, none of that is ever going to work over here. If we're going to have socialism in the United States, it's going to be a socialism rooted in the struggles that have gone on in this country. It's going to be rooted in the feelings of people here in this country. It's going to be rooted in the traditions of this country. And we're going to draw from Marx, and we're going to apply the laws of historical materialism. I get your point, Jonathan. I got you there. I'm not saying we should reject what Marx said. I'm not saying that at all. We should study it and we should know it. In fact, we shouldn't just know Marx. We should know Lenin, and we should know Mao, and we should know Stalin, and we should know Trotsky, and we should know Che Guevara, and we should know Hugo Chávez. We should study all of the anti-capitalist revolutions around the world that have happened. We should study them all. But we should be figuring out how it is that we can make and create a kind of socialism that will give wing to the dreams of the American people and really bring the American people and help them to fulfill their aspirations and their dreams. And furthermore, we need to find a progressive side in the American people, right? That if slavery, awful. Mass murder, genocide of the Native Americans, awful. There's a million awful things about the USA. You can talk about all the murderous wars that have gone on. You can go down the line. There's plenty. I'm not saying anyone should stop criticizing any of that or deny it or defend it. Don't get me wrong. However, if we are going to try to change the United States of America, we need to fit ourselves into the progressive side of American history. There was Jim Crow in the USA. There was the Ku Klux Klan. There was also Martin Luther King. There was also Nat Turner. There was also Malcolm X and Huey Newton. And that throughout U.S. history, for all these evil things that have gone on, there have also been progressive people who opposed the wars, who opposed the killing. And that is who you need to be if you want to be a socialist in the USA and you want to do more than have a temper tantrum on the internet, if you want to do more than make yourself feel good at rallies, if you want to do more than be a puppet of some of the most wealthy people that are, having a turf war with some of the other wealthy people, and if you want to change the United States of America and in the process change the world and get rid of imperialism, you need to figure out how you can be an American and how you fit into American history. Just feeling good about yourself and, raging and tantruming against the world is not going to cut it. If you really want to change American society, you need to figure out how you as a socialist can be an American and how your views and your perspective fits in with American history and the trajectory of American civilizations. That's what you need to understand, that we need a socialism with American characteristics. We need a socialism that will be embraced by the people here. And I'm not just referring to the white working class. It's not my point. We're increasingly becoming a country with a lot of folks from Latin America, a lot of folks from the Middle East, and it should be a socialism that includes everybody. We should be inclusive, and we should make efforts to address the needs of communities that are marginalized and oppressed. We absolutely should. But if you think that you're going to impose some foreign ideology on the USA, if you think they're ever going to, the USA is ever going to, adopt Mao Zedong thought as its ruling ideology, I don't know what you're smoking. You're smoking a lot of marijuana or something, because that's complete delusion, right? Socialism in the United States will be socialism based on the aspects of U.S. society. It'll be emerging in order to resolve contradictions in U.S. society, and it'll come because millions and millions of Americans will think it is in their best interest. And that's what's missing. People aren't going to guilt trip the revolution. We're not going to make a revolution by making everyone feel guilty about the crimes of American empire. We're not going to go door to door and say, oh, don't you feel bad about, what they did to people in Iraq? People are going to go, oh, yes, I feel bad. Let's make a revolution. That's not going to happen, okay? That's just not how people work. Right? The ability to step back and look at the crimes that this country has committed around the world and feel shame and guilt about it. That's a very, very middle class, that's a very privileged way of viewing the world. That socialism in the United States is going to come because people in the USA think that the old way is no longer tolerable and are looking for a new way forward. That's how socialism will come to the United States. People in the United States will want things to change. They'll want the economy to change. They'll want our relationship with the world to change. And capitalism will continue to get worse. And yes, we will be able, I believe we are going to have socialism in the United States. We're going to have socialism in the whole world. It's the next stage. History is like a train speeding forward. However, it's not going to come from the middle class left. The people that the Ford Foundation and George Soros and the Rockefellers are funding right now to lead their Stop Trump rallies that get promoted on CNN, those people are not going to build socialism. I guarantee you that. They will not create socialism in the United States. They won't do it. They don't even like Bernie Sanders. They think he's sexist for running against Hillary Clinton. Okay, if you think that the Stop Trump movement or the alphabet soup of, political parties led by burnouts of the 1960s New Left, if you think they're going to make socialism, you're delusional. I mean, I was part of that world for a long time. I was the golden boy of a certain Marxist group, and I saw over the course of years that those people don't want to win. Those people are reenacting their youth. This is like those old people that go to Grateful Dead concerts that they've been going to for years. These people are going to rallies and they're, peace, man, I'm against the system, brother. That's not going to make the revolution, right? The revolution is going to come from ordinary working class Americans of all nationalities and races saying, we've had enough of this, and it's time for the economy to be organized to serve the people. That's where socialism is going to come from. And socialism is going to embrace science and historical progress. It's not going to embrace the occult and mysticism. It's not going to embrace drug use and self-destruction. Socialism is going to be about making a better life and constructing and getting over this alienation where people feel like they have no obligation to other people. That's where socialism is going to come from. So I'm approaching 2 hours here. We've been on 2 hours on live here.
And I see Walter Teague. Now, he says, Ronnie Miller, the 60s I organized in, was not against or trying to separate from ordinary Americans in the midst of ongoing slaughter and oppression. We were doing all we could to align with and support the rights of those oppressed and used by the system. And if that's where you were at, well, that's a fair point, Walter. I'm not going to argue against you. You know, the 60s movement did a lot of great things, right? I mean, the Vietnam War was horrendous, and the fact that they organized and opposed it, it got to the point that soldiers were refusing to fight in that unjust war. That wasn't a bad thing. I'm not against that. And the protests against the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement and the black liberation struggle, they took place in the context of a booming economy in the United States. At that point, you know, there was the left, the white student activists, there was the black community, which, you know, rebelled all over the country, especially in the aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King. However, you know, at that time, the USA, you had this huge, you know, hard hat, white working class in the USA that was doing pretty well, had a good standard of living, and had no interest in left-wing organizing. And after that, you had the new communist movement, and you had a lot of these Maoists and Trotskyists. They got jobs in factories, and they tried. And they spent a decade, about, you know, the 70s, they spent going to work at their factory and selling commie newspapers to their factory workers and trying to recruit other white workers, mainly they were white, and trying to recruit white workers to communism. And it didn't work. And it just didn't work. For a decade, it didn't work. And then in about 1978, you had the Nicaraguan Revolution, you had the Afghan Revolution, you had the Iranian Revolution, 1979, and you had the big economic downturn in the final years of the Carter administration, and you had a lot of leftists who were saying, it's going to happen. They said, finally, right, we have an economic downturn. All right. And so finally, the white working class, you know, we've been working on for 10 years. We've been going to work and trying to sell these people commie newspapers. Finally, they're going to get it. And what happened then? We had the rise of Reaganism. Why? That white working class said, well, look, it's been good for so long. We're having an economic downturn. Maybe we should go back to the way it was before. So we had, you know, the rise of Reaganism. And in the aftermath of that, most of the organized political left said, you know what? It can't happen. The white working class are just inherently reactionary. You know, they're racist. So we're going to, we're going to go back to the universities. We're going to focus on what, Huey Newton and others called the lumpen proletariat. We're going to get jobs in the labor bureaucracy. We're going to kiss up to the Democratic Party leadership. They all found something else to do other than organizing the white working class because they decided that after 10 years and after finally getting their hopes up at the end of that 10 years and it not happening, they decided it couldn't be done, that you couldn't organize the white working class. And now things have changed. Now that white working class is suffering, and now artificial intelligence is eliminating the role of labor, and now there are millions and millions of white workers in the USA who are mad. They are mad at capitalism. And unfortunately, the only people who are trying to agitate and organize them are the far right, are the right wing. And the left is ignoring them. And it's following, there's a saying that the generals always fight the last war. That's a military saying, right? The general is always fighting the last war. Right? Because, you'll think the last war, they think about what they did wrong, and so they're fighting the last war. The left, the generals of the left, the people who led the 1960s, they're fighting the last war. And the last war is over. We're in a new period. Russia and China are rising with planned economies. Social liberalism has been, hijacked and utilized as a mechanism for attacking anti-imperialist states in the third world. There's all kinds of problems in the global economy. The white industrial working class that was kind of the layer of right-wing conservative politics in the USA is being demolished. Things are changing drastically. We're in a new situation. But we're doing something really, really special here. And it's been 2 hours, and I just want to end on this note. I've been talking for 2 hours. People who know me are probably not surprised by that because I have a problem of excessively talking in social situations. But when you're on Facebook Live, no one's going to stop you. In fact, and I appreciate everyone engaging with this, and I've loved the conversation here. But we're having a conversation here, and I just want to make the point, before I end, that what we're doing here is very, very special. And that a lot of people don't approve of the kind of conversation we're having here. And I'm not just talking about the CIA and the FBI and the ruling elite that would like, the conversations that we're having here not to happen. I'm also talking about the fact that there's a lot of people on the left that don't approve of these kind of conversations. So all of you who've been here, all of you who've been watching this Facebook Live have a responsibility. You need to share this page. You need to promote this conversation. You need to get this live out there and this conversation we're having out there. I think this has been somewhat of a success. I think I'm going to do some more of these lives, but we absolutely need to have more conversations like this, and we need more people engaging with the kind of ideas that I'm engaging with you all about right now. if things just keep going the way they were going with the cultural left organizing around the Democrats and the far right and the racists organizing around one section, around Trump and the Republicans, and them at each other's throats and Antifa and, oh God, we're in a bad situation in this country politically. We need to have the kind of conversation we're having here. I'm trying to do my part because you know what? As much as I've been angry before, as much as I've been frustrated, I love my country. I love the people who live here. I love my fellow Americans, and I'm worried about you. I love everyone in the world. I love the people in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Eurasia. I love the Russians. I love the Cubans and the Koreans and the Chinese, but I love my people. You Americans, people here in the USA, you're my people. I'm your people, and we're having a lot of problems here, and our problems aren't going to be fixed under the current system. And we need to have a conversation. We need to come together. I love you. You all love me. And we're having a conversation here that's very, very special and unique. So we need to bring other people into this chat. And we need to spread the word here. And we need to have a conversation with people around the world because things are tough. These are hard times in America. These are hard times in the world. So I'm sorry if I've offended anybody. I'm sure I have. But that's okay. Sometimes you have to offend people in order to teach them something. We're having a good conversation here, and I wish you all the best. And I will be doing more of these lives, if not here on Facebook, on YouTube. We're doing something very special here. I love you all, especially all of you who commented. We are part of a little revolution. That's what's taking place here on this Facebook page, a little revolution. And I'm glad that you all are along for the ride. We got to have love in our hearts. We got to not have hate. We got to think rationally and control our emotions. We got to think scientifically and promote rationalism and human progress. We got to move ahead. Humanity's in a rut. These oil bankers and billionaire monopolists are controlling things and holding back progress. But the human being, the human species, has pulled through much harder times than this. And I'm confident that we will emerge victorious out of the high-tech dark ages created by the Wall Street billionaire elite. Science is moving forward. The human drive to advance and never surrender is continuing to proceed. No one's going to stop us. The long march of humanity continues. Be sure to tune in once again. Thank you all. I love you all with all my heart. Have a good afternoon.